Hi, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make the herringbone cowl I'm wearing. And I plan this as part of a series. So today I'm going to show you a very simple way of producing herringbone. This is called Herringbone 1 in a lot of knitting books. And it's produced by knitting stitches together through the back loop. So when you see that in a pattern, you'll know which herringbone it is. And it looks like this on the considered the right side of the fabric, and the wrong side you'll see the ridges, and it produces a very dense, thick, cushiony fabric. It's great for rugs and pillows and everything else. Now, when I made this, I twisted it once when I sewed the ends together, and I made it on the short rods so you can see that my ridges are going up and down. When I knit this on the circular needle, the hoop, the ridges will be going around the scarf, and it will change how it drapes and how it hangs. You'll notice that my edge is curling inward, and that is just the nature of this particular stitch. You could do something different on the edges, and you'll often see patterns that are, and we'll be doing that when we do the second in this series, which is a rug. I do it differently on the edge. So this I made with Woolies, Thick and Quick, and it is 106-yard skeins, and I made it with one skein. I had 13 feet left, and its finished size before I sewed it together was 8 inches deep. Of course, it doesn't look that way because it curls a bit on the edges, so make it wide enough. And it was 24 inches around before I sewed it together. So that's what you can do with one skein. This gray one, the light gray, I did with the Hometown USA, but this ply separated so easily. You know, acrylic yarns, I think that's just the nature of them. So it was a little harder to work with. It's very hard to pick a yarn for your project because it depends on what you want it to do. This is such a thick, dense fabric, and I had never knit herringbone before. It makes a great cowl, but to get it to drape is a little tricky. So something like this, Patton's Alpaca Blend, is much too fine. It's a number 5. And I had bought this fuzzy alpaca yarn to do the one in the round, and I hated it because this halo is so fuzzy it made the whole thing kind of mat together. So be careful when you choose your yarn and do a little swatch. For instance, I'm considering doing the knitting in the round with this yarn. You can see how much looser this is. This was knit on the larger size that's equivalent to US 19. And the one I'm wearing is a US 17. Now, I had trouble when I sewed my edge together. So I'm going to show you a new cast on. And you'll see that one edge of this on the bottom is longer than the other. And it's because this knits up so tightly that if you do a stockinette cast on, or a slingshot cast on, or a long tail cast on, even on this bigger one, the US 19, look how my row is kind of splayed out. It's not tight enough there. So I'm going to show you, this is knit on the US 17. Again, it's hard to see the herringbone because it's striped yarn. But notice how much tighter this bottom edge is. And I'm going to show you the cast on. And so let's get started. So this is called a cable cast on, and you only need to have a tail about 6 to 8 inches long before you make your slip knot. So I just do a simple figure 8 slip knot, put it on your pipe, okay, and have your working yarn off to the right. And so just to keep it out of the way of the camera, I'm going to actually tape my tail back here just to keep it out of the way. Now you have one slip knot on your pipe, and I just always by habit cast on to the right side, but this is easier for me to do from behind. When you see this in a knitting book, of course, it'll be on straight knitting needles, and you'll need one crochet hook. And what you'll do first is take your crochet hook through that slip knot from right to left, just as if you had a knitting needle. There's, I'm sure, other ways of doing this, but this is the easiest to do, I think. So now take your crochet hook and loop it around your working yarn. Put a little tension so it's easy to pull that through. So now you've pulled a loop of yarn through your, and you'll see that if I pull up on this side of the working yarn, and that's exactly how you want it to appear, so it's come through, and now pipe that loop so that it is going around the pipe this way, if that makes sense. Now the second one, we're going actually between these stitches, so you want to take your crochet hook and put it in through between the stitches. It'll look just like this if you could see it underneath. Make sure that you're underneath both of those. Now again, take your working yarn, grab a loop of it with your crochet hook and pull it through. If it won't come, you've snagged one of those two strands of yarn. Now pull it up. Again, the working yarn is coming through the stitch, around my finger, and back down to my ball. And pipe that loop just like that. You don't have to make it real tight if it makes it harder to get under there. So again, the crochet hook goes now between the top two stitches, the ones closest to the tip of the pipe. So going between the stitch and under, get the loop of working yarn, and only the working yarn, pull it up, and again, from underneath, it looks like this. So now your working yarn is coming through the stitch around my fingers, back down to the ball, and it gets piped like this. And each stitch is worked between the top two, and it's done the same way. Right to left, hook the yarn. Now let's make sure. See, I grabbed that a little bit. Make sure your crochet hook, by the way, isn't too big. It'll help you keep it up against your pipe there. And again, it'll look just like this as it comes through. And pipe it. Don't make it too tight, because remember you have to knit those stitches. And the ridge will start to look like this, and that ridge will be underneath. You can use your finger on the other side to make sure you're underneath both those strands. So it looks just like this. If you can see, the loop is coming between the two, and it gets piped just like that. If you have trouble going through, it's suggested that you leave this last stitch a little looser so that you can put your, of course they would use a knitting needle, we're using a crochet hook, and then tighten it once that's through. So we got 2, 4, 6, 8. We'll do 2 more. Now we have 10 stitches on, and it looks just like this from underneath. They'll be fairly firm. There won't be a lot of stretch between them, and that's just what you want. So now we're going to move the camera, and I'll show you how to do herringbone. Okay, before you begin knitting, and you have your stitches on, again, I used 26 stitches for the woolly scarf, and I used 30 for the one with the Hometown USA, the acrylic yarn. And I twisted the scarf when I joined them. So you want to mark that edge, and it will be just as we did in lesson 6. And you want to start at the first. You just won't see V's. This time you'll just see this little twist, and you will begin right there in front of the, it'll be a little offset because you did that slip knot there, but that's where you begin with your stitch markers and go all the way down. Don't forget the one on the end. You should have 10 stitch markers and do it just like lesson 6. And you can do cast off from either side. If you're when you go to make the scarf, by the way, with this particular pattern, you can use odd number or an even number of cast on stitches. It doesn't matter. So now turn it around. Obviously go all the way down, makes for the cast off. So now let's begin. And I have these, this is the size equivalent to a US 19 needle, and they're made with that PVC pipe. And, you know, that's over there in the plumbing department. Hot and cold water pipe area. And what you'll do is take your working yarn in your right hand side. So it'll look bigger than the scarves I made. And I'll switch to the pipes and I'll show you the difference. So we're going to start it on this just because I think it's easier to see. So the first thing you want to do is take off the first 2 stitches. And of course it's going to look a little weird because your working yarn is back here, but it doesn't matter. So take off those first 2 and put them onto your left finger. We're working from right to left. Take your working yarn, and you want to have a little bit of slack in it because it's easier to put it through the opening. We're going to be knitting 2 together through the back loop. In fact, you're going to say to yourself, why isn't this a purl stitch? It's where the yarn starts. You're not putting the yarn up here as you normally do. The yarn will be below the knitting. So now you're going to take your finger and you're going to kind of squeeze your yarn between your fingertips, if you will, and push it through. Now, let me make sure I'm showing this. When you do that, see how I have a hold of these first 2 stitches? Now, as you take that through, you want to make sure they don't shift positions. So notice how then I'm holding these 2 stitches with my right hand as I pull the working yarn through. Now, pipe it so that the working yarn is coming through the stitch around the pipe to the inside and back down through the middle. Now drop the first stitch. Keep the second one in your hand. Take off another stitch. Add it to the one you've already knit. And do the same thing. Grab your working yarn about an inch or so back from the stitches. And the reason I say press between your fingertips because it helps guide your yarn into place. As you do that, you're taking your left hand out and grabbing the working yarn and keeping a hold of these. Now, notice that if I'm looking at the top, I'm going to splay these out just a little bit more. You can tell that this stitch is closest to the new stitches, and this stitch is closest to the old ones. Underneath, it's a little harder to tell that. But up top, it's easy to see. And the one you want to let go of is always the one you've already knit twice, if you will. And you want to keep that second one. When you see this written for straight knitting needles, it will say, knit 2 together through the back loop, slipping only the first stitch off the needle. Well, this time on the stationary rods, we're slipping both stitches off the needle every time, but we're picking this back stitch, the most recent stitch, the one that's closest to the old stitches. It obviously goes, and if you keep a hold of these as you pull the yarn through, it will prevent these from twisting because it's easy to get mixed up. Now, on the 19s, you'd want to pull this a lot tighter. On the 17s, I kept this fairly loose. Remember that this Woolies has a lot of spring to it, where something like a roving does not. A roving will have a lot more drape, but this will be tighter and denser. So just be aware of that, because this is an unusual stitch compared to what we normally do. You can see how small this hole is. I can get my finger in here fairly easily, but when we go to the 17s, you'll see it's a little trickier. Each time I'm grasping those 2 stitches as I pull this through, piping it. The working yarn's coming through. You can see the working yarn. I've already knit these, but I'm still going to pick up that second stitch and add the next stitch and knit those 2 together. Pull my working yarn through, pipe it, tighten it, now I find it easier if I have my finger through that stitch and I add a stitch. It kind of keeps that opening patent. You know, you always have little threads, especially with those rovings. So always dropping the first, if you will. You can think of it that way. Keeping the second Now here's your last stitch. So now you knit those two together and pipe it. And notice now I have 2 stitches around my working yarn. You're going to pick this bottom one up. Again, the last stitch you took off. And all I want you to do is pull it up onto the pipe. So it's down like this around the stitch. Repipe it so that it faces the rest of the stitches. And now you're ready to begin another row. So again, make sure you have your working yarn. Take 2 stitches off, put them on your finger, and make sure that the front stitch is where it should be. Make sure you don't twist those two. The first one will be tighter than the second, but notice something. The working yarn is actually this second stitch, not the first. So be careful of that. Don't just pull your working yarn, or you'll actually lose your second stitch. And now go ahead and pipe those, or knit those 2 with the working yarn. Repipe your new stitch. If you let go of it, that's okay. Just look towards the top and it'll be easy to see. Don't look at the bottom because they cross here. I'm referring to right here at the top, and you can see that this is the stitch that's closest to the old stitches. Take off another stitch. Now you have 2. That next stitch will look just like this when you take it off. If you happen to drop it, make sure you don't twist it before you knit it. And every time, what you're really doing with the yarn being down is you're wrapping it around the stitches. Coming in from behind, hold those 2 so they don't twist, pipe it. Again, this is where I'm not really paying attention to how I'm forming these stitches up here. This is where you have to pay attention, because on the 17s, the PEX tubing ones, or whether you've made it out of 1/2-inch dowel rod or whatnot, I watch these stitches. Now my body's in a weird angle right now. I'm not sitting where I normally would sit. You want to look at those stitches and make sure you're not pulling them too tightly, unless you need, on these 19s, I'd want to pull them a lot tighter just to make my stitches tighter. Each time I'm doing the same thing. I'm grasping these 2 while I pipe the new stitch, dropping the first. What you can see here is that my second row is a mirror image of my first row. This is the first pattern so far that I have found that I could not reverse my second row of stitches to knit something from straight needles. This is not how you do it on straight needles. And all you have to do is this mirror image back and forth. It is one of the easiest stitches I've ever done. But making it beautiful is one of the hardest. So now, again, take this second stitch and pipe it. I really think of this more as a utility stitch. I even bought a huge roll of jute that I'm going to make a rug with. But anyway, and it's just the same thing all over again. You notice I've repiped that last stitch. Take the 2 off. Again, if you're not careful and you pull on your working yarn, it's this second stitch. You don't want to lose that stitch, so be careful about that. Go in through behind, pipe it, drop the first, and make sure those are fairly snug at the edge, because otherwise your edge will gap a little bit. You'll see that in a minute. Drop the first, keep the second, take off another stitch, knit them together through the back loop. Drop the first, keep the second. Each time it's the same thing. There are other ways of doing the edges, but this will give you an edge that is very straight. But if you knit this too loosely, you'll also have an edge that has a loose edge stitch. Now, that's your last stitch. You knit those together, pipe it. You'll see your 2 stitches going around, but it's this last stitch. Just pick it up and put it back up onto the pipe facing the other stitches. Now let me show you something. I'm going to switch to the US 17 and you'll see how much trickier that is. You also might want to put on your shorter uprights. I found for this pattern, since I was working everything underneath, it was more comfortable. So now we're going to switch to this. And this row won't be hard, but again, it's the first two. Come in behind. Tighten that up. Now that you're working on the 17s, you have to pay more attention to your tension here. I pretty quickly just got to the point where I could see the stitch and know that that was the tension I wanted. If you have trouble with adjusting your tension, remember that you can always wrap some Teflon tape around the fronts of your pipe and make them a little bit bigger, but make sure they're equal. Now notice if I pull too tightly, here's my new stitch in my right fingers. Here's my working yarn. If I pull on this side of that stitch, watch what happens around my pipe. Notice that I've pulled this stitch rather than pull my working yarn. That's where you can get a little bit of flaws in your tension. And so you want to make sure as much as possible, so I did that the wrong way. Notice that it has to go up like this. So you want to not pull on the back side of your loop. You want to pull on the working yarn itself, if you know what I mean. So you want to be careful of that. Notice if I pull this side again, pull this side of the loop, I'm pulling this instead of this. And that's not what you want to do. You want to keep those even, especially if you're trying to make your tension loose on the 17s. It actually goes much faster than I'm showing you. This is, just because it's easier to see what I'm doing. Each time I'm kind of rolling the yarn into the, notice how I'm kind of rolling it in there, and that's important for the next step. Now again, this bottom stitch is the one you pick up, put on, and now I'm going to switch this, and you'll see how it gets trickier here. So now when I take these two stitches off, I have a much smaller opening to work with. I got a hair in there. But it's the same thing. Come in, hold on to those, pipe the new stitch, drop the first, keep the second. Notice how this is considerably smaller. Now I can't really get my finger in there anymore. I can get my fingertip. And this is what I say, this idea of leaving yourself some slack, putting your stitch up there, pressing your fingers together, and kind of just rolling it onto there. You only need the very tips of your finger if you do it that way. Hold the two stitches in your left hand, just roll the yarn in, but that's why it's important to kind of keep track of those. This is where you have more difficulty keeping those from crossing. You don't want to mix them up when you let them go. My cat thinks I didn't feed him, but I did, so don't listen to him. So notice, I can get my finger in there. You want to be consistent. But, I can't get my finger in unless I really force it, and you don't want to do that. A yarn that stretches out a lot, if you pipe it so that it's stretched out, it's going to be distorted when you let go. And that creates a fabric with no movement whatsoever. And this pattern really doesn't anyway. Again, drop the first, keep the second, put on your second stitch. This is the last one. And again, it's this bottom stitch. Just pull it forward and pipe it like that. Now, oops. So here's your reverse side. In fact, the back will be to the outside here. So if you take this off and you get confused, remember that the right side of the fabric is facing in. Okay, this side will be facing out. But what I want to show you is this. So now you have your edge that's pretty tight. In fact, there's a little bit of curve in, but that will help you when you could make that looser if you were going to make a scarf that hung down. I'm not so sure this pattern would work for that and not look stupid. I tried it and I didn't like it. Now notice on the edge here, as this goes along, you will have a very straight edge with no knotting to it. But this is fairly loose. So if, see down here where I was on the US 19s, and you can see these openings, and that really shouldn't be there like that on this pattern. And also it makes this fairly loose. But it's an okay edge for sewing things together. If you wanted to make a rug in panels and wanted to use this stitch, you would catch this last stitch on the edge to knit it together, and it would give you a nice straight edge that's easy to butt up. And it's also a nice soft edge. It's okay when it touches your skin. So that's how you do herringbone 1 on the straight needles.